in a note format if you
Okay.
want.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
So we talked about last time the staff and sort of motivations and what makes good quality staff, and different living history sites and how they train their staff, especially Conner Prairie, because they have the most. Like I said before, and I'll say it again, if this was the live format version, we wouldn't have all these great resources from the internet. They would have been our guest performers in real life. So we're using a lot of their YouTube stuff. Well, and we'll revisit some of that today. Not the exact same things, but this chapter, and this is probably the quickest chapter. I mean, this rounds it up, so we have some time at the end. Originally, the way I did this, I was going to have like questions and answers, and maybe you have some. It is about creating relevance, and this is still only partially defined. So back in, I would say, 2010, a museum person named Nina Simon, she took over a museum, an art and history museum in Santa Cruz, California. And while the model she's going to talk about in this video I'm going to show you is very much about sort of, it comes from the art history, art museum world. The skeleton, the bones, and the message in it is very, very relevant. And part of what I tried to do with this series is not recreate the same old wheel, right? Because I think we've all seen living history be a thing where it becomes pretty repetitive, and you fall into the trap of not really having something original. And that was one of my goals for this, was so that you could tailor and have your own living history program that is meaningful, instead of just let's do old-timey things with old-timey stuff. The next person we're going to see after that is a guy who's caused a lot of kerfluffle. I wasn't a fan of him at first, I got to be honest, but the more I listen and watch his career and his blog, the more I become intrigued with his methodology. I don't agree with everything anybody's said in our, but there's good nuggets here. And the gentleman's name is Frank Vignoni. He got his fame with his own business called Twisted Preservation, which is his blog too. And he's now the director of Old Salem Historic Village in Salem, South Carolina. It's a Moravian sort of, starts in the 18th century, very arts and crafts, folkways based. And we'll look at that, and sort of one of his anarchist workshops at a historic house. Now, these are pretty short videos. And we'll go look at some examples I pulled of some colleagues' work that I admire, and some of the larger institutions, what they've done to create relevant history. And then we can do some more question and answers, and we'll go from there. So if you have any questions, feedback, let me know.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll share the screen, and we'll get started with Nina Simon's video. Let's see here. You're going to see something that is, I'm not going to show yet. Hopefully it doesn't restart itself. There it goes. So this is a TED Talk from a couple of years ago. Listen to how you might apply this to your own setting. We'll talk about it, because obviously some of the things that she's doing would be not characteristically living history or history museum based. But I've run into some of her work, by the way. I think that I can see her influence in different museums. I don't know if you're like me and go and visit other museums around the country when you have a chance, but 2 years ago I was in San Diego at the Museum of Man, and they were definitely modeling her ideas. There was a beer exhibit about the history of beer from around the world, which had a participatory piece I've used some of it here in my new exhibit about the boom and bust cycles and archaeology related to people traveling through Platteville and visiting the fort and leaving a footprint of your own experience as a person. And once we pull this back into living history, I think it'll be more subtle than what she's doing. But the idea is there, the thinking outside of the static room with a person in costume idea solely is what I want you to take away. So here we go. This is a TED Talk. Tell me if you can't hear it, you know, give me a high sign or something, okay?
Okay.
So here we go. It's about 12 minutes long.
I bet you can think of something that matters to you that you wish mattered to more people. Maybe it's your business. Maybe it's a political movement. Maybe it's an art form you love. Today, I want to share with you a bit of what I've learned about how you can invite people who are outside your circle into that thing that matters most to you. I run this museum, the Museum of Art and History in Santa Cruz. We call it the MA. And today, the MA is a thriving cultural center for our community. But when I showed up as its new director 6 years ago, it was in trouble. We did not matter enough to enough people in our community, and that was causing two really big problems. The first was money. We didn't have any. The day I walked in the door as the new director, we had $16,000 in the bank, we had $36,000 in unpaid bills, and there was no magic philanthropist ready to bail us out. We were talking about closing the doors of the museum. At the same time, though, we had an even bigger problem, and that was a problem of relevance. There were more people in Santa Cruz County who knew that this building used to be the county jail than knew that it was now a museum. And it had been a museum at this point for 20 years. We had to find a way to matter more to more people in our community. We had to make the museum relevant. But how do you do that? We couldn't just declare relevance by fiat. People choose for themselves every day what we think is relevant to us and what we think isn't, what we're going to attend to and what we're going to ignore. How do we make those decisions? Research shows we ask ourselves two questions to decide if something's relevant. How much meaning am I going to get out of this experience? And how much effort is it going to take for me to have that experience? We ask these questions every day. How much meaning will I get out of seeing that art exhibit? Is it worth the effort of figuring out when they're open, buying a ticket, finding a friend to come with me? How much meaning would I get out of volunteering in my community? Is it worth the effort to find the right place where I really feel like I'm making a difference? How much meaning would I get out of going into this bar? Would it be fun? And what would it take to get me in the door? At the MA, we knew that people were not walking into our door. They didn't see the meaning there. And I've started thinking about this not in terms of physical doors, but metaphorical ones. This idea of relevance as a key that unlocks meaning. If you think about that thing that you love living inside a metaphorical locked room, for you, you know there's value in there, and you have done the effort to get that key. You walk in again and again to the good stuff inside. But for an outsider, they don't see the good stuff. All they see is a locked door. And they have to decide, is there meaning for me on the other side of that door? Is it worth the effort for me to figure out how to get in? Or should I just pass on by? At the MA, we knew too many people were passing us by. And so we went about the work, not of selling people the door we already had, but working with outsiders to open new doors to meaning in ways that worked for them. I don't believe surf history should live inside a building. For you, art is a celebration. Wonderful. Let's celebrate. As we worked with more and more outsiders, we learned what made art and history meaningful for them. And we learned that the meaning inside our room wasn't really about art and history. It was about using art and history to build community, building bridges across our differences, and coming together. Opening these new doors with outsiders changed our museum. In my first 5 years as director, we more than tripled our attendance, and we went from that $16,000 in the bank to $1.6 million, with which we could extend our impact in our community. And we did it thanks to all these outsiders, all these people who 5 years ago didn't even know the museum existed, and are now coming in and supporting what we do. I'm not going to suggest that bringing in these outsiders was easy. It isn't. I think we sometimes have this fantasy that the way we're going to invite outsiders into the things we care about is just by opening our existing doors wider. We'll start with the insiders we have, the experience we have, and we'll just open that door wider and more people will come in. This doesn't work because outsiders are the ones who are choosing to pass by those doors you already have. In our experience, growth looks more like this. And to achieve this kind of growth, we had to take some perfectly nice walls of our metaphorical and physical building and turn them into construction sites, opening new doors to new people in new ways. Now, I'll say most of our insiders, most of our Purple Circle people stayed, but they stayed as we were turning the place that they loved into a construction site, opening new doors in ways that were unfamiliar or even uncomfortable for them. Let me give you an example. This is a flyer from the first ever pop-up museum in Santa Cruz County. It was the night before Valentine's Day, and the theme was F My Ex. We invited people to bring objects from failed relationships to a bar, put them out on tables, handwrite their own labels for them, boom, pop-up museum. I think you can probably imagine looking at this flyer, how for a certain kind of person in Santa Cruz, this was a key to a door that they did not know existed, right? They looked at this flyer, they said, well, I didn't know we had a museum in Santa Cruz. This looks cool, I'm gonna come. I think you can also probably imagine some of our insiders who were distressed by this flyer. A little marketing tip here, I do not recommend putting the F letter alone on a poster. But more seriously, these insiders said, you know, the irreverence of this program, the ephemerality of it, it runs counter to what I think a museum is all about. They were asking, why did you have to tear down that perfectly nice wall and put a neon pink door over there? Who is it for? And the answer is, it was for outsiders who would find meaning in this kind of cultural museum experience differently than in a traditional one. And the new outsiders who walked in weren't just people who were attracted by posters like this. They were people who saw the meaning changing. In the wake of this flyer gate, we had this guy who wrote in and he said, you know, I'm closer to the stodgy traditional museum supporter than to the audiences you're currently trying to reach, but I strongly support your efforts and outreach and attempts to involve new communities. He said, because of this outreach, I finally became a museum member last year. There was no reason for me to do so before because the museum was doing nothing. I think this is so fascinating because here you have a guy who's saying, I'm like an insider, but I walked past that insider museum. In fact, I thought it was doing nothing. Now he's involved. He donates because he sees the meaning of what we're doing in bringing our community together. If you want to open new doors to outsiders, they're going to be neon pink. They're going to be uncomfortable because relevance fundamentally is not about you telling somebody what you're about. It's about you empathizing with how it feels to be outside that door, trying to figure out if it's for you. Remember this bar? My guess is there are some people here today who look at this bar and see an invisible welcome sign above the door, right? It looks fun, it looks intriguing, you want to go in. My guess is there are also some other people in this room who look at this bar and see an invisible keep out sign above the door. It looks scary, it looks dirty, you want to pass by. We see these invisible welcome and keep out signs everywhere, and it's part of how we decide if something's relevant to us. So at the AMA, the approach we've taken is to work with partners across our community. Here are just a few of the hundreds of partners we work with every year, outsiders who can help us see what says welcome and what says keep out for them. I look at this picture and I see tech entrepreneurs, I see farmers, I see community activists, all of who can say, hey, for my community, this looks like welcome, so let's frame out this new door over here like this. Outsiders have really become my heroes in this work, and they're people like Betty Reed Soskin. Betty is the oldest park ranger in the National Park Service. She's just over the bay in Richmond, California. And one of the many amazing things about Betty is that she doesn't just wear this uniform when she clocks in at the park. She wears it when she's off duty in the streets of Oakland and Alameda. And Betty says, when I wear my uniform on the streets of the city, I am announcing to young people of color a career path and an opportunity that I didn't know existed until I was in my 80s. And Lord knows I don't want other people to have to wait that long to figure it out. Betty's using her uniform as a kind of welcome sign, standing at the door to the park and saying to her community, hey, come in, this is for you too. But every community is different, and what says welcome to one can say keep out to another. This is another one of my heroes in the National Park Service. This is Cam Juarez. He works in Tucson, Arizona at Saguaro National Park, and it's Cam's job to invite Latinos into that park. And one of the first things Cam said when he got this job was, you know, for my community, for Latinos living near the border, this uniform you all are so proud of, it is not a welcome sign. It is a keep out sign. The hardest part of working with outsiders is not finding them. It's listening to them. When they say to you, hey, that uniform you're proud of, that door you love, it's a keep out for my community, what do you do? That's the challenge that faced librarians at the State Library of Queensland just a few years ago. Next time you're in Brisbane, Australia, do yourself a favor and go visit the State Library of Queensland. It's the most beautiful library I've ever seen. White, gleaming, contemporary, open plan, really amazing. And I was there shortly after its opening as part of a group who were designing an Indigenous knowledge center, a Kuruldagan, for this library. So there we were, architects, designers, librarians, and Aboriginal elders here in this white gleaming space to design this Indigenous knowledge center. And the first thing that the Aboriginal elders said was, you know, for us, sharing knowledge doesn't happen primarily through books. It happens through music and dance, it's intergenerational, and it's got to be colorful. It can't be so sterile like a hospital. And you could see the librarians looking at their white gleaming space with new eyes. And then the Indigenous elders said, you know, and the most important way we share knowledge is around a fire. I don't know how many librarians you know, but this was one of those moments of truth, right? They had to decide, were we for real when we said we wanted to welcome Indigenous people to share knowledge and build community in this library? Or were we secretly hoping they would be grateful to walk through the white gleaming doors we've already built? And to their great credit, they were for real. And they took one of those white gleaming spaces and they made it a colorful space for families and music and dance. And even more impressively, they built a fire pit outdoors so that groups like this Indigenous World Youth Congress could say, this is the place where we want to share knowledge and build community, because this library feels welcome to us. It matters to us now. And so I invite you one more time to think about that thing that matters most to you and the metaphorical room in which it lives. What are the doors to that room like? Who do they say welcome to? Who do they say keep out to? As you work to think about how you might invite outsiders into this place that matters to you, I urge you not to think of this as a marketing exercise. Sure, you can paint a fake door on the side of your wall and outsiders will come once. But after they've slammed their head into the wall and walk away feeling that sense of disrespect and mistrust, they're not going to come back. Instead, I invite you to open your hearts to the outsiders you most want to involve in your community and work with them, get to know them, and then generously, courageously work together to build new doors. That's the way to matter more to more people. Thank you.
So let me see, let me share the different screen here. So that's kind of goes with what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go in and talk about thinking outside the box. Can you see that? You still looking at, hold on.
Still see Ted.
Stop. Okay, let me see here. Sorry, I need to get my Zoom act together over here. There we go. I think this is the right one. So let's see. You should say chapter 3, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. I don't know, my connection at the office today is a little shaky, so hopefully. So the relevance equation, what I want you to take away from that is the idea that there's a model that exists, and the model has been around for quite a few years. Matter of fact, I was reading recently that in the 1890s, one of the World Fairs had one of the first, maybe it was the 1876 World Fair. Yeah, I think it was, because it's a centennial. They had an edition of the, like a living history village that was colonial. Can you hold on a second? I want to shut my door. Hold on. So they had their own version of a living history village type setting that was all of the colonial era and people dressed up. And so this model of open air museums and house museums, which we'll hear about in a minute, has been around for, 100 some odd years now, if more, not more. And so we're really, why is it not? There it goes. It's really haggard, tired, and we're even taught in museum school and interpretive formats to think in very similar styles, that the history is, is the foremost thing. And it is, don't get me wrong. History is extremely important. It's sovereign to what we do. I use that term a lot. But that the museum is also, to be whatever kind of museum or setting it is, the stuff is also more important than the story. And I love my collections colleagues. They're great people. But man, have we had some, just like a married couple, we've had some amazing disagreements over my career, because I have always thought the stuff is mute, without the people involved, without the story being expressed. And I, taught in traditional museum interpretive world that people tell these stories, not cards. When I started my career, there was a national park survey study done on the effects of United States national parks museums and how wonderful they were. And they took a metric for their text panels, and the average person spent between 18 and 24 seconds reading text panel. I wonder what it is today, now that we have smartphones, right? So it's time to change that paradigm, and there's a few people working to do that. And Nina Simon is one that just across the board is opening that up. And you can go to YouTube and find other talks by her. I recommend. I always find that I get my best ideas partially through thievery. I'm not gonna, but the inspiration is what I'm really talking about, is somebody else's ideas. Like, how can I apply that to what we're trying to do with living history? So artifact-driven environments have been the staple. I mean, they're really cool. But if you can see in this picture, the settee in the back, the couch, if you will, has a rope across it. Normally, you peer into rooms, somebody tells you an amusing anecdote if there's anybody there at all, and you go on, you go, great, I've seen it. So that's the static spaces and set pieces. They're often set up in mind, sometimes based on, I used to think people like studied how this stuff was set up. We'll see that they don't. Sometimes they do, but again, I love my collections, brothers and sisters, but oftentimes they're just exhibiting the artifacts and what makes sense to them, not necessarily how they were used. So I think across the board in the last 5 to 10 years, it's safe to say that most museums are moving away from what I call the reliquary setting, which is either an exhibit space solely with artifacts set up, or this sort of set piece, as you found it settings, as I call them. And some of the best museums, some of the most popular in the United States, are still that way. I just was at Mount Vernon again for the second time. I hadn't been in 20 years. Took my daughter there. She was not around when I went the first time, and she's in college, and we went there together, and of course she's rolling her eyes, but it was very much the same as I remember it. And for her, it was a new experience. But what's happening is as to attract visitors to even fulfill the mission, people are like, well, I've seen Mount Vernon, or I've seen, the Pioneer House at X, we'll say. And Mount Vernon, what Mount Vernon has over the Pioneer House is that it's George Washington's house. So, George Washington's he's never going to get old, in the sense of national history being an epic figure. The pioneers of House X, those folks, you've seen it once, you've seen it all. So that's the challenge to us as professionals, is how do we continue to interpret these houses by you know, lesser known historical people, just like you and I, who, why is it attractive again and again and again? And part of the other flaw is that the programs are simply based on old time activities when there is a program, right? So we're going to churn butter. Matter of fact, there's a funny, I should show it. There's a funny Connor Prairie commercial where they're all making fun of their old, you know, their old timey skills. And that's one of the things. Yes, we still churn butter, but ... And then we start getting into what these houses do. They show up the past as a parody, and often as it's supposed to say as, not a, as harder. Life then was more difficult in the good old days. I think that one of the reasons that I gravitate so much to those universal meanings, like we talked about in the first, with the food and the shelter and love and hate and cold and hot and all those things, is that that's all relative to the people living the history, right? I'm sure we will look back one day and tell our relatives or those who come behind us when we're long gone and say, yeah, my life was hard for me at that time because that's what I knew. And these things uphold the generality of the experience. They don't really teach real history. They don't teach the more conscientious methods by simply teaching us. And there's a time and place for that. But as history, the vogue for historical teaching, or the lack thereof, or the quality of it, and that's all arguable, depending what school district and what type of school you go to. As a primary and secondary school, we're losing some of that. I hear that from teachers all the time. So I think the generality needs to be more specific. And then if you become general, then you start excluding voices, or you start misrepresenting them. And you start avoiding difficult narratives. I think part of our job is, as historians, living historians, is to touch on not all the difficult narratives have to be socially volatile, but if you work in a 1900 farmhouse and maybe you do need to teach something about 30 years later when there's a depression. People need to know about that, and why your grandparents, your great-grandparents have a different view on life. So these are the old models, typifying ways we look at house museums and living history museums. It's like, okay, we're going to go churn butter, a guy's going to shoot a gun, and we're going to learn about old-time furniture. We need to look at being more topically, the way to integrate those old models into new models and be captivating and captivate interest. And that's why trends and social consciousness and thinking outside the box, which is today's real theme, is so important. So we're gonna look at what Frank Vignoni does. This is a short video. Again, Anarchist Guide to House Museums is on the first. He does some pretty radical things, and let me preface with that. He has a 40-minute talk on YouTube as well, which is worth watching. He ran 24 approximately house museums for metropolitan New York City back in the 90s, and he couldn't figure out why less than a few percentiles were people not going to these house museums, city house museums across from parks and other venues that you would think with tourism that would attract them. So his goal became, how do we reinvent that? And by looking and repurposing spaces and getting rid of the model of this traditional house museum, the traditional living history museum, he was able to tweak things. Now, you need to go look at his work at Old Salem. He's currently there. He is universally loved and loathed by many. I'm not saying that Frank has the total thing, but he's definitely onto something, just like Nina is, that we need to look at this model and analyze it. So let's see. I'm going to change the screen again. A lot easier today with my old computer back here.
There you go.
Let's see. And so we'll look at this one. I'm going to close this window. Look at this one. That's Frank. And so he's going to take, he takes this, I'll set this up. One of the parts of his workshop is they take tags and reinterpret the artifacts and set them on on the pieces. And I believe they are at Old Salem here or another house museum. And they're looking at ways to reinterpret the space. And of course, if you're a collections person or you know anything about collections management, if you see this going on, you would probably faint at least or have a heart attack. So here we go. Here's Frank. Let's get it turned up all the way. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
First of all, it's 3:15. We started at 2:30, and I'm bored. Note that. So what we're doing is we're doing an anarchist guide workshop at the Vogler House in Old Salem. So we've allowed our group of MESDA Summer Institute students and professors to come through with our anarchist tags and just experience this house and give us their kind of crowdsourced comments about how they would interpret this house and how they would make the visitor experience better. We're decentralizing the experience. The typical experience at a house museum is that you get a tour guide, you stand in the hallway, and there's ropes up because you can see right here, actually make it so you can't come in here. So what we're doing is we're starting to see what ways we censor our visitors in their experience with simple things like chains, text boxes, placement of furniture. So after today, we'll be compiling all this information and then we'll be having a discussion, I think in a week or so, about ways that we can start to incorporate kind of new innovative ideas. So this is interesting. It's not something I tell participants at workshops, but it's a really significant part. So we came here at 2:30. It is now 3:25. Part of these workshops is to see when you get bored, that's number one, and number two, which rooms you congregate to and start acting like a normal person. And so what's happened is we've got two rooms that we have totally rearranged the furniture because they weren't habitable the way they were before. They were stage sets. And now if you can just scan these two rooms, what you'll see is at 3:25, all of a sudden, this group feels ownership of this site. Someone on Facebook Live said, you've got world experts on this time period, it's a shame they're not involved. Well, guess what? They're not involved on purpose, right? Because I believe that these sites should story without someone telling the story for it. So when we first started, everybody was really tentative. Didn't want to touch anything. It took a while to take some chains down. I had to take the chains down. I had to kind of force some issues. A few of you went up to the attic. Who went up to the attic? And so that attic is not interpretive.
I'm looking out that window there, from out there, because somebody every day is looking out that window, wondering who carried all this furniture up those steps, and probably into that attic, wondering all of that. As soon as I went up there, it's definitely hot up there, which it probably would have been. And there's a lot of space, and there's probably a lot of individuals that were up and down there.
Old Salem is now, since December, moving on a new project to locate every slave dwelling in Salem. And you are sitting right now in a house where there is a slave dwelling, which is upstairs in the attic. Now for a minute, let's talk a little bit about objects, because that's what you guys are here, right? You each have picked an object. It is interesting because the main changes we made were contextual, right? Objects became stories based on the sequence of kind of relationships. On that table over there, we wrote a story about somebody doing needlework, sitting with somebody reading, sitting across from somebody else, I forget what they were doing. How do you see this idea affecting research that you do?
When I get to hold a cookie roller that Vogler actually carved with his own hand, I'm right there with them.
I'd say just it's putting actual people and actual stories and actual lives.
But the truth is, if you have a site that's not interesting, we won't even be able to have our brains open to the point that we're going to listen to the people.
So that's the, I believe it's the Museum of Southern Decorative Arts is the name of, that's what MESDA is. And And so if you see with that experiment, I would love to do this. I wish I had, because that would be so much better. Because so many times you go in a place and it's set up to make sense. Well, if you watch some of his other talks, he explains that concept out, that they started doing this with their set pieces, and then they let one room in the house, let's say, be one where you could interact. Now, one of the things I do like about Conner Prairie is they did this years ago, not to this methodology, but if you go to Conner Prairie, you can go into the kids' room and play with all the toys and lay on the bed and all that. There is no sacred collections pieces. That was super controversial in their 1990 redo of what was traditionally a static building zoo house museum. And so I think Frank's onto something. He's done a lot of stuff like, and again, go search YouTube for both Nina and Frank and get some more information about things that they have done, because what it's doing is causing us to go outside the formula that has been around forever and ever. And it's time, because museums themselves are changing the way that they function and what their meanings are. Let's see. So can you see the old model slide now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's see if I can go into here. And all right, here we go. So let's see. How do I advance this now? Hold on, more technical difficulties from Bill. Any questions about anything so far?
No questions, but I have to say that that one we were just looking at with Frank is just, I am going through that right now. How do we take these just things and make a story and bring it to life?
So one of the things that happens when he does that is that he brings in a group of people. Like, you remember, there was a person drinking tea, there's a person knitting, and there's a person on that. They create that and they leave it that way. And one of the things he talks about is there's moments in time where you're super active in a room, like your bedroom maybe. And getting up in the morning was, I think, an example he used. And they try to leave those things. Instead of being like, your grandmother's house, or in my case, my mom, she wants the house perfect. It's a set piece. Well, I think most people, there's activity in the house. So yeah, there might be a book open, somebody was doing homework and the kid walked away. That's what they're trying to do. And also too, they're trying to give spaces where, when we're going to talk about this a little bit more, where you can move things around. You're not interacting solely with collections pieces. And that's an expensive proposition, let me tell you what, because I've done that in a couple places. To get similar items that are either reproduction or antiques that fit the space in the middle and then allow people to function with them, that can be really costly. But there are programs that you can do in specific rooms, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that are specifically that way. Plus, to answer your question in another way, we're fighting 100 years of museum school. I mean, I just got my master's in 2016, and it's still, and I have plenty of interns here, it's still, don't touch the stuff. Stuff is preserved for perpetuity. It's not going to be impacted by human hands, and if it is, it's going to be used. There are protocols for handling it and storing it. That's something about the house museum that needs to change, because nobody's going to these as a house museum per se, because there's no activity and there's no, again, going back to Nina, what's going to get you to walk through my door that's going to give meaning to you? And if you think about things like the kinds of visitors, the nostalgic, the lifelong learner, the things we talked about before, there's motivations for why they come to museum, and that's kind of what we're trying to do, is take these wild ideas that don't seem characteristically permissible in museums and making them part of the museum world. So here we go, here's our next one. So this is the difference, and there's a lot of words in these this time, but characteristics of relevant living history museums and sites speak to the site itself. So they're always going to still, this is one of the worries that, and what I'm reacting to here is what my colleagues have said to some of what these folks have said is like, well, if you do something new, you will no longer be site or collection relevant. I don't see how that's possible. What you're doing is you're using all your resources to engage people.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to still speak to your mission. You're still going to speak to your narrative. You're just using a new tact to do that. And that's what's important, you know. If all people see is, you know, the same old, eventually people will stop coming. And you know, social trends and social consciousness are what dominate our daily modern concerns. So why not draw parallels to those? I think there are people, at least I do as a historian, get comfort from the fact that the more things change, the more they say the same, unfortunately. That there were people in the past who looked these same problems, challenges, day-to-day life in the same manner. And so your museum living history model doesn't have to take on slavery if you're not comfortable with it. Take on those things that, you know, boil it down to something as easy as like, okay, we're a farm museum. How do we preserve all this food so people would survive the winter in a time before grocery stores? That's totally relevant. And people are intensely interested in this stuff, especially right now, okay?
True.
The other thing is they limit the use of restrictive space, or they keep it to as a lower percentile of their museum exhibits. So I have an exhibit gallery that's typical traditional museum stuff. I redid it when I took over this museum 4 years ago, and some people don't like it, but less and less people don't like it because they've seen what we've done to make the rest of it work. And that's part of what makes it work. And maybe you do always need to have a traditional space for folks with its casework. There's an audience for that. It's what people think, because again, as we talked in this week 2, chapter 2, we're authoritative, right? People want to see the real history. They want to see Abraham Lincoln's opera gloves or a stovepipe hat when you go to the Smithsonian or where have you. They want to see those real, authentic pieces of the past. But without the story, those pieces are kind of mute, as I said before. The other thing, and this is the big note today, is that there's reciprocal feedback actually used for something. I don't know how many museums I've been a part of in my career that collect visitor feedback and don't actually monitor it. And there's one of Nina's presentations on YouTube there. She talks about the quality of that feedback. And we still have struggled with this here, I'm not gonna lie. You have the guest book, people write, Bob and Laura Smith, Evergreen, Colorado, maybe their contact information, and leave us a comment. This was great, wow. Well, what we've been trying to do more and more is qualify that. You know, tell me why it was great. What part of it was great? What part of it was not so great? We can't be afraid of negative feedback. Negative feedback is just more, as often sometimes the person who's brave enough to tell you is telling you something that many people didn't want to be rude enough to tell you, or, you know, this perception of. So that's very, very important. And yet you can still use that information to continue to be historical, but to speak to what interests people. The main reason I got into museum is innovation. Museum work is educational innovation, telling stories in a new way, telling the history in a new way, and allowing people to see it in a new light. There are a million myths for every historical period, right? I mean, obviously, depending on who you are, these are all different meanings. You could do for the Western United States, you could do something about, well, pioneers came here to take land from the Indians. Oh, really? Let's talk about that. Let's explore that through living history and through narrative. Maybe it's more complex. We're not saying they're right or wrong. That's left up to the visitor. But the information we're going to present to you will allow you to have a more informed opinion and know more of your heritage. And you don't have to lose authenticity. This is another big thing that when Frank talks that my colleagues get nervous about. You don't have to lose authenticity. You don't have to give up being historical. Just use it in a different way. Really good relevant museums allow for exploration. In other words, there's spaces that you can do things in. There are exhibits you can add your own commentary to. There's your own way, even if it's simple as making your own orno bread, your own way. You're allowed to do exploration, have an opportunity for reflection. One of the things Frank is doing in the initiative for the slave houses in Old Bedford, or Old Salem, Museum, is there are rooms of contemplating what slavery meant to the people who lived there. And they're really Spartan because slaves weren't allowed to own a lot of property. And you can spend as little or as much time as you wanted there. You can leave your own interpretive tag in some of these. These are new ways to explore the historical space. And then finally, conversation. We talked about this and we're going to continue. Living history is best as a conversation. Best delivered by live people because that allows their expertise to come out and you get deeper meaning. And then finally, we can't ignore the age we're in. We are now, I sometimes when these using multimedia or using computers and so forth can be done very good or very poorly. But there's a portion, ever-growing portion of our society that uses multimedia every moment of the day. Mm-hmm. And, I have two in my house. I have a 20-year-old and a 5-year-old. They're both using it constantly. We can't ignore this.
Right.
Nor do I think we're in danger of being replaced by robots in old-time clothing, which is a lot of what I heard of before. That being said, I once visited a large museum, a living history village type setting in the early 2000s, which took this to the nth degree and recorded everyone and then put the recordings on large screens in their historic homes. That was horrible. It took away the experience. So we went into a food preparation kitchen. It was for dairy, so there was cheese making. Uh-huh. I didn't pay all that money to see. I want to have the intimate experience of relating to somebody else. So does that make sense? This is what relevance, how you create relevance. And hopefully you get some outcomes for this, which we'll talk about in a minute, that are self-reciprocating. So do you see any ways, Karen, that you can use this information?
Oh, totally. Absolutely.
I mean, I don't know who your boss is. If they're like me and have been in the museum world way too long, I'm sure they're probably gritting their teeth and, going, what are you talking about? But it's going to happen. It needs to change. It does need to change. We need to become different than we used to be. So.
Yes, for sure. I'm kind of right in the middle. Yeah.
I think people hear change, and the way we've always done this means that we're being replaced. That is not the case. I think there is a case for relevancy in what we do. So we're going to talk a little bit about my buddies. I got two good friends that work at Nash Farm, Grapevine, Texas. I actually have three. But they've taken this idea without even really talking about it and using it to their advantage. And so they look at trends in the history world. They look at trends in the modern world, and they try and blend those to make programs and elements that go beyond. And there's countless more examples. I just pick on my friends. It's easier, and it helps them. I mentioned the sock hop dinner sort of barn dance that they had. They created in the first week. to me, this was brilliant. They have a fried chicken dinner that goes with it. They have a rockabilly band. People can bring their old cars. The old car shows sort of classic cars from the period of the 50s and 60s. And that makes those exhibit pieces of the actual buildings, in this case, where they actually have a memory of doing this, and allow people to share what they love about history by bringing the old car there and dressing up in 1950s, 60s sock hop clothing and having a meal, having that community. And that's really when I heard they did this, because I wouldn't have thought of doing that. I'm in too much in traditional mode at this point when I heard about them doing this. But it's brilliant because it's outside the box, and it really got more people to come to more things. And ultimately, the relevance part of it is why you're doing it. You're doing it to create, first of all, I think the Living Museum should die a death to technology, be replaced by robots and screens and, talking screens and that sort of thing. It's already been done. It was done in the 80s when they invented the VCR. They put a bunch of them in museums, threw in looping tapes and DVDs and let it go. That's great, but that doesn't replace people. So the relevant program really takes on, if you can't do relevance for whatever reason, so let's say your boss is like, nope, we're going to be a house museum like all the others, the way you can address it is through programming. And oftentimes it's not possible to change the whole thing. It really takes courage to say we're going to use the collection for stuff, because that's you're talking about the public trust. You're talking about people. I mean, maybe the people who gave you the historic house, their descendants are still alive, right? And so you have that problem of, well, how do we make that relevant so everyone can engage in it and still not degrade what little we have left of that history? So I'll show you some ideas of what they have done through their little commercial blips here. Let me see here. Let's go into screen share. It disappeared. Why did it disappear? Stop doing this. Sorry, I lost it again for a second. Here we go. And we're not gonna watch this one yet. We'll come back to this in a second. I gotta move my control button there. So this is one of their first things. I like to use this as a basic example. Just a couple of years ago, they'd already done the sock hop, but this is how they expanded their circa 1900 history into an intimate setting. They basically went out and got a local chef to cook historic recipes and serve it in the historic home. And I'll let the rest of this is only about 2 minutes. I'll let it speak for itself.
In the 1800s, around the end of winter and start of early spring, most of what was left were root crops, like turnips.
You know, there is something unique about farm fresh vegetables. They just have a better taste.
In the 1800s, the Nash family couldn't just go to the grocery store for all their needs. They relied on their kitchen garden. And this time of year, it made them get quite creative with some of their dishes.
So we are going to make farm fresh dishes just like we would have back then. So turnip mash, hominy grits. And when you taste it, you will taste the difference why farm fresh is so good.
So there you go, a short blip that, did you see the ticket price, by the way?
No, I was looking at all the other things. What was it?
And that's their function. That's their functioning farm kitchen. I've taken a class in there actually.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And so when we look at that, we can say that's punching so many of the buttons, that type of thing. I get meal,
Wow.
which I get community. I'm meeting new people, which is something that's kind of alien to us today, I think. I think a lot of people think, you know, and I know there used to be supper clubs and family style restaurants and things where people would sit. And you don't run into those as much anymore. And so they're tapping into that memory as well as creating those that group experience. All of their stuff is extremely popular, and they continue to build on by firing off of what they know from doing these relevant programs. So let's go back into that for a second. We'll look at the slide. So a lot of relevant programs have some or all of these components. It's very often hard to do all of them unless you're, you know, really got free reign. But open environments, okay? You can walk through the house.
Yeah.
This idea that you can't have food, can't have drink in the museum has been abolished. But there's a reason for that. I mean, those things attract pests. So if you attract pests, it's going to impact your collection. Well, you have to be dedicated as well in maintaining open environments and maintaining their cleanliness and being meticulous. A lot of these things, and this goes, I've said this before, minds on, hands on. I can tell you there's always a hands-on component to a good one of these. You're allowed to touch stuff. This idea of the reliquary has been abolished. I mean, maybe you have a place in your museum like I do where there is that, but when you're in the living history program environment, that's no longer the case.
Right.
Relate to visitors as authorities in their own experience. So there might be story sharing, there might be nostalgia, there might be a component where they leave comments or write their own artifact tags, or they, in some cases, it's just the social setting that they share. And that addresses so many of those visitor types we talked about last week, where people are interested in being part of the museum and their history being remembered, even if it's only for a moment. A lot of relevant programs aren't, and this is something Frank, I want to key out, that he said, we've come from a place as museums where we're the authority, because we are, I mean, in the historical knowledge, but we're the authority telling you what you're going to experience. Part of this paying attention to trends and paying attention to feedback is identifying things people would love to do or learn how to do. One of my top selling experiences is making moccasins from scratch, complete, because people are fascinated with that art form and how people lived. And we put it in a setting where you have to be in a communal setting. You can't be, and that's why we're not doing it right now. It's killing me. But, you know, 12 people sitting around poking their fingers with needles and sharing the experience is much more valuable than me standing and telling you about moccasins. Speak to specific histories, okay? Again, a lot of people get freaked out. And if you look on the sign, Nash Farm was built in the late 1880s, 1890s, but they recognized there was a trend for vintage baseball, and they have a large space. So they started having vintage baseball games. It's not really specific to their site so much, but it is the national pastime. So teaching American history, they brought this vintage baseball game in. And they allow people to play too, which is pretty brutal. It's pretty, there are no gloves in 1860. Sometimes you have to tackle challenges, and it allows you to tackle some of the challenges to your site and change them. I know for a fact, I don't know what their story is, but I'll tell you mine. I was at a big history museum where we had a ranch, and everyone was deadly afraid of running the wood-burning stove in the Pioneer kitchen because it could burn everything down. Well, fortunately, people who set up the exhibit put it in properly, And with a few minor adjustments, we took care of the burning things down. But oftentimes, in order to have relevant programs, it tackles the challenges of your site, which I don't look at as painful so much as a win-win for your site, and then sort of abolishes that, gets that out of the way. And the money is often, you can build in the cost of that challenge in recouping it through becoming relevant. So it's a justification for having a cooking space, or if you do pottery or whatever. Those functioning things end up paying for themselves, is my point. Oftentimes they embrace many voices. So you're not getting the Civil War experience simply from soldiers, you're getting the Civil War experience if you go to a relevant Civil War museum that talks about the civilians, the woman's experience, the child's experience, the experience of the now emancipated slave, for example. All those things are brought to the fore. Maybe if you're doing a food waste program, you're talking about starvation or about mortality, or you're talking about a very specific ethnic foodway that became ours as an American people, but it talks about those ethnic people that brought it here. And I think and most of the time they draw conclusions and outcomes from the universal nature of those universal human experience nodes that we talked about in the first week: thought, hunger, thirst, joy, pleasure, fun, happiness. All those things are part of that recipe. Increasingly, with the social consciousness part of it, there's more need than ever to draw parallels between past and present. So if you have social issues, I would encourage you to carefully and diligently, with prudence, tackle those, talk about them, because if you don't, you're really only telling part of the story, and therefore it can be tantamount to a lie if you're not doing it. And people want to hear it. People want to get it out in the open, especially in this day and age. And currently, right now, as we're speaking, this is very poignant. And then finally, there's a part of this where the visitors help create the museum. And there's lots of different ways to think about this. In a farm setting, it might be having a community garden that's directed into those historic crops for the museum. I've done that a couple times. Or maybe they take part in rearing the heirloom animals if you have that. Or your volunteers, your best visitors become volunteers. And they're creating that. A lot of art museums, they get to do an artistic space where they create their own installation, or they become part of the creation of that installation. We need to think in the living history and historic terms how those different models can work for us. And it's really powerful when people can leave their own footprint, fingerprint in the museum exhibit. And so that oftentimes adds value. And I think the point of Nina's talk is that if I'm part of something, I now need to go see it again. I think when you leave a footprint, you want to revisit that. That's very important. So we'll look at another here, Nash Farm program that speaks to kind of how they look at building community. And let's see, share this. And this is the Storybook Adventure Passport. So one of the things is Nash Farm's part of a 3 or 4 site system. They have a train, they have the farm, they have a system. And so they created a way to engage their junior youth visitors, so children, school-age children, in exploring all of those. It's a marketing tool, don't get me wrong. But and this is not the first site that's ever done this. I'm not like, wow, this is totally original. It's just another great example that you can use within your own exhibitry or your own museum system, or through partners. And that's a huge part of building relevance, to create partnerships and multiple visits. So here you go. Can you see this?
Join us for
Yes.
Summertime Grapevine with the Grapevine Pioneers Storybook Adventure Passport. Explore our museums and historic sites with 6 fun passport activities, all based on children's storybooks. Here at Nash Farm, you can make a toy sheep with fleece from our heritage sheep. You can also make a wooden boat. Plus, you can enjoy the farm with all of its animals and activities, or even bring a picnic to enjoy under the shade. Head down to the Grapevine Visitors Information Center for a fun kids exhibit, Storyland. This engaging exhibit explores several fun storybooks. Then you can travel over to the Grapevine Vintage Railroad, design your own railroad bandana, and finish out your experience at the Grapevine Tin Shop by making your own tin nameplate. Passports also include a complimentary movie pass to the Palace Theater. We want you to know we are taking precautions for visitor safety this summer, and we hope to see you in Grapevine, Texas.
There we go. So that's very, very rudimentary, but that's sometimes all you need to shift the interest of your visiting public, your visitors, and your commitment from the public to your site. Something new. And getting back to last week's topic, visitors versus staff, I often find that the staff are probably the most resistant to new things, especially if you come in as a new person and the site hasn't been changed in a long time. This is the way we've always done it. And that can be troublesome, but we really got to get out of that idea, because what's hurting museums is the same old, same old. It really is. Let's go back to the slides here. Is that the right one? I believe it is. No, it's not the right one. Hold on. Why does it keep, okay, hold on. Are you seeing a slide or
I'm seeing.
when I do this? Are you seeing the slide when I do this?
No. Now.
You're seeing the Grapevine guy, right?
Right now I see the Zoom screen with the 3 of us.
How about now?
And that's a black screen. It says you're starting screen sharing. Back to
Anything
Zoom.
that?
No.
Oh, darn it. Okay, give me just a second.
Oh, sure.
Oh boy. Any change?
There, a screen, slide, relevant program.
Okay, good. We're back to basics, okay?
Right.
Okay, so this is what I think why they have success when they haven't had success before, because they wanted to change it and make it more meaningful. So this is going back to what I just started talking about. Staff need to be relevant to the program as well. Sometimes this is hard to do, because what I was getting at is this traditionalism. We love our traditions in the museum world, our protocols, our rules, our way of behaving, and there are times when you don't want to do, especially now, the typical museum experience, which is very much dyed in the wool, don't touch, stand behind the curtain, stand behind the rope, don't speak out, whisper. That's all changing. And so, especially for staff that either have museum background or have done it in different places where it was very much that way, it's time to encourage them to change their ways. And that's done, like I said last time, by listening to them, retraining them. And we really need to get out of this idea that museum staff are guides or docents or information centers, and more customer service facilitators. If you read the book that I put in the first week, Experience Economy, this is so critical. whether you wear a costume or not, whether you're just answering the phone, you are selling, your product is what people experience when they visit. Why should they pick your place if you're not excited about it, passionate about it? Why would they pick your place over somewhere else to go? And that's the thing. You're facilitating the experience. You're making it happen. And what's also important is, as much as they're doing that, we as administrators need to have a real, genuine sense of analyzing and utilizing their input, their feedback. Because oftentimes, I don't know about you, I do a lot of strategy and accounting and personnel work, and I'm more in the theory ends of things than I ever was before. And for me, this is gold, because I may come up with some idea for baking bread in an Orno, and it may not actually work for them. Allow them to adjust. Allow them to tweak what they're doing to what makes sense. Don't ever write a program or make them do something that's so set in stone that it's unfunctionable because you want to be right or whatever. I've seen this happen. We need to be in such a way where people can, that lends it to that explore part for the visitor, where they get to explore the museum setting. And again, conversation. We're gonna look at some museum theater in a second, but there's always a question and answer or interactive with the character part, just like we saw in the first week. People need to have the ability to feel a part of something. That's our magic. That's our tool. So, and they really are, they're not, this is the other thing, is that probably more so, even though we tend to have this subconscious look, well, they don't get paid as much as I do, therefore they're expendable, or they're not as important in their role. We need to stop that, because they're really the key to the museum experience. Whoever is wearing the costume or the logoed uniform or what have you to do the experience, they are really your treasure. And so developing them, investing in them, giving them the best material, listening to them, treating them with preference will only make your program better. And I've seen this time and again, where it's just, as employees, interpreters are sort of a necessary evil. We can't do that either. So, any questions about that?
No, it's very true.
And I mean, it's so easy. And I mean, to burn interpreters out with and cause resentment when you don't do that. It's very easy to get lose good people because they're just like, well, nobody cares what I have to say. You're just going to do your program the way I'm the one that does to physically do it. So let's go back into the computer screen with we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'll show you some more relevant programming, kind of coming full circle back to our large mega museums of living history. We're going to look at a couple of presentations. One really new from Connor Prairie, and then one a little bit older from Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Both are sort of getting more into, well, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation has done museum theater in the streets for a long time now, over a decade. Connor Prairie, I don't associate that with them, but they have had theater programs. So we're going to look at, this is up to the minute. This is 5 days old, roughly, when they filmed this. This is up to the moment response. This is the power of well-funded museumship coming to the fore to make a social commentary program that's relevant to visitors in their area, and also taking on that challenge of addressing a hard issue. So here you go. You see the screen?
Yes.
We hope you can join us this weekend for a performance of Journey in Search of Justice, written and performed by Asante Children's Theater. A cast of 9 performers from Asante will perform 5 scenes that focus on pieces of Black history at different moments.
Didn't mean to do that. All right.
Throughout history. For the last 6 years, the Contemporary Theater Program and Asante Children's Theater have partnered on various projects to combine the past with the present to address current and future societal concerns, putting into practice diverse groups of performers that focus on 21st century issues. We believe a small part of addressing these concerns can be found through having partners, such as Asante Children's Theater, to help tell and bring these stories to life. For more information on Contemporary's theater program, Asante Children's Theater, and to purchase tickets, please visit our website.
Okay,
Step into the story
like
at Contemporary.
Is that's going right into your community, pulling people in your museum, and using them for what they're best at to get your message out and to address and to bring relevance to a thing that is happening right now and to show its impact over time. And that's our power. That's what we're really supposed to be doing as museums, is drawing those connective and having those conversations. Now, I don't know if they have a conversation in this one. I just realized that. I was just floored by how quickly they got this together. This is like Indianapolis, Indiana, and they are dealing with this head on. Kudos to them. This is really, really, really high level museum work. Now, you may not be ever able to do that. I know I can't here with my site limitations, but this kind of thing is very, very powerful, especially for the younger audience. And so we're going to kind of go back in time a little bit, about a decade, maybe a little less, to Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And they were interested in bringing Native voices to the forefront, realizing that colonial American history, a lot of the ethics of the government are founded on Native American principles. Most people don't know that, but they are egalitarian parts. And so they wanted to show programs about Native America. So we're going to watch 2 of these.
I think it's very important that American history be rediscovered by our youth. I think it's important that we all get from this play and from the different series of plays and street theater that we have in Williamsburg, that we are all human beings and that we all need to coexist together.
We were, human beings. I mean, we had feelings and emotions as well as the Europeans, and we went through hardships and I guess just the humanity in the Native American people back then. We weren't just bloodthirsty savages.
I just want to kind of get out to everyone, let them know that there's a lot more Native American culture than people realize at the moment. Whereas a lot of people just consider the majority of Indians are all Plains Indians with the teepees and war bonnets and whatnot. Just kind of give them more broader aspect of the entire Native history, basically, which basically the history of America. Native Americans play a very integral part that's not talked about a whole lot in society.
So I'd like to, try to be an example of what Indian people are today. Not so much what Hollywood has created, what the Indians should look like, or in some cases what society has thought what the Indians are like. So, hopefully we're breaking a lot of those stereotypes and educating people, and that's one of the benefits of being here. As a lot of the guests that come here, they're wanting to learn, and that's why they're coming to a historical place like this rather than just going to an amusement park.
So the next part will be Larry talking more in depth about how they came up with the project and the sample. Here we go.
Katewa, I too feel we are in danger. There is no reason to act with the long knives. We must act quickly.
Remember why we are here. We have come to this place to protect our people.
I was actually walking through Colonial Williamsburg when we were here as guests, and one of the questions I asked them was, where's all the Indians here?
The American Indian Initiative is an effort for Colonial Williamsburg to put Native peoples and Native history back into American history.
We have worked very closely with different people in the Indian community as we have developed programming for the American Indian Initiative. And we made the commitment that if we were to portray Native Americans in dramatizations that we would stage here, that we would cast Native actors in those roles.
Who here gives us real respect?
I'm playing Newa, and he is the son of Nimwa. He is a peace chief. I'm a Koche peace chief, and I am here for the months up to June 8th, 1775, where we are hostages of Lord Dunmore, to be able to prove to the Commonwealth that our word is our bond.
In the fall of 1774, Lord Dunmore raised 2,300 militia in the western counties of Virginia to war against the Shawnee along the upper Ohio River. As a part of the peace agreement, at the end of Dunmore's war, 4 young Shawnee men were identified to return to Williamsburg with Dunmore as hostages, but to act as a peace bond. This story of the young Shawnee hostages who came here at the end of Dunmore's war was probably one of the best fits that we could come up with in regard to sort of further enlightening people about all the different facets of the revolutionary story. Okay, let's just pick it right back up from the top again, and I'm probably going to stop you this time because there's some cues I want to tighten up and make some adjustments with. But the energy was fantastic that time.
It's not as easy as you might think to find Indian actors, because in some cases, some are in specific areas of the country, and a lot of people think, Indians are all Indians. But there's Cherokee Indians, there's Lakota Indians, there's Montana Indians. So when you cast Indians to be in a film, you try to go, to that area first. The good thing for me is, and I see with a lot of Indian people, is they've still kept their culture. They still go to ceremonies, they still have sweats, they still, whatever their traditions and might be in their particular tribe. The reason why I like working with the actors like that is because they can bring their culture into their character and portray it better that way, because they know it in their heart.
They're wearing what we consider accurate 18th century Native American Shawnee outfits based on antiques in other collections. We have a few antiques in the collection here, but not really enough. You use documents, and then you also use art. Costumes are, of course, a cultural marker, and how we determine to put these together and clothe our bodies speaks volumes.
Native history is American history, and the only way to really be more inclusive of getting Native stories, Native people into American history is to represent all the diversity and multiple facets of the American experience that is African American, that is Euro-American, that is American Indian. Bringing those narratives together gives us an opportunity to look at different ways of viewing the past. It makes it a richer, more complex social history.
So there you go. I kind of like to use that as an example of to erase the fear that and the resistance, because when I wrote this, I figured there'd be some of that. This is a great example of how you can still have the character and the authenticity of history through all the pains of making costumes and getting the right people, and still address the challenge and relevance of social justice and how we look at race in America. And the American history is everybody's history, right? That stuff is hard to do. I'm not saying that you or I could do that with our level of resources and stuff, but if you can easily still broach difficult subjects by including the right people, the right partnerships, and sticking with history and keeping it relevant. So, okay, back to the slides. Let's see. Any questions so far?
No, it's a real eye opener to just see all of it.
Now, are you looking at a slide now?
No, it's still the
main
screen.
Okay, let's try this again. Hold on. Screen share. Oh, that's why. How about now?
No. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Okay, there's a slide.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we'll go on. We've only got a couple more slides, and so you can tell there was a lot of design and thought that went into these. It doesn't have to be, but what I like to do on a small scale is include the interpreters who are going to deliver it, come up with the idea. Oftentimes they come up with the idea for stuff, and we make that happen. It's relatable. Again, relationship to past and present is important. Always integrating observance. Here's another thing that is very critical that living history can do very badly, is make people participate. Never do that. Always allow for voluntary participation. If somebody doesn't want to roll pie dough in the old time kitchen, don't make them do it. Let them do it for themselves. And that's why the conversation thing is always where we come back to. Sometimes people don't want to have a conversation. Don't force them. It's
right.
Allow them to acclimate and be comfortable first. And encouraging that feedback. What's the measured value for them? That you again, surveys, books, comments. Here's a very a big deal. Pay attention to TripAdvisor and Facebook and Instagram. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And be there when there's a positive comment. Be there when there's a negative comment and address it. But that's the new tool for also gauging your effectiveness. And allow them to, if somebody wants to leave their bread there, don't force them to take it home. If they don't want a recipe card, don't force them to take it home. And try to encourage the dialogue, which is going to create on whatever that media is. You know, send a follow-up email if there's a question. Matter of fact, at some museums, people will used to have a postcard, 15 cents at the time, write a question out for the curator, he'll answer it. And we used to make our curators do that. It was super effective. That's what's building your community, is that ability to the connection. Oops. So how do you know you're doing it correctly? And then I think that was, relevant design. So the measurable goals, what are they? Well, some of them are more or less not measurable, they're more instinct, but there are some. And I love that this is a total publicity stage shot from Conner Prairie. You see the Pilgrim kids playing with the kids and the family's all happy. I mean, we know this is set up, but there's something to this. I've seen this millions of times, millions, hundreds of thousands of times. So you're hitting your marks this way. And this is really what we're about. Detailed comments and feedback, not just in writing. Visitors are trapping you and telling you how much they loved it. And don't be, if you have to, break away and come back, but never cut them short. Always make time to hear it. And be sincere about it. When they compliment you, give us a sincere thank you. Create a relationship with those people. And I'm going to tell you, 8 times out of 10, they come back. I mean, they come back if you do that. If your durations of engagement in those living history settings, those programs, are prolonged, you're doing it right. Case in point, I mean, when we built the Orno, we had a kid out there whose parents were like watching their wristwatches, but constantly they'd let him go on with it. He was there for 3 hours. You're doing it right.
Exactly.
Repeatable experiences, so like the workshops with the moccasins, people tell their friends, they come back. If you can continually fill that repeatable experience, you're doing it right. It's akin to repeat visitation, even if the people haven't been there before. And this goes back to your interpretive staff and your museum staff talking of these things up as well. Organically creating this visitation. Increases in volunteerism. If people had such a good time, they want to be part of it. Now, if you notice, we haven't talked about money yet. I specifically left money off this list. Too often times, museum accountants are, hey, how much revenue have you made? I'm not saying it's not important, but that will come secondarily if you're doing this right. Word of mouth, organic visitation. So in other words, my kid went to a field trip here, loved it. Now we're bringing Aunt Martha and Uncle John. We're out from, New Jersey to see this. Right. That is a sign of success. High social media engagement. So people asking questions, asking, like, the COVID's probably doing more damage on this organic visitation social media engagement right now than us not canceling a program. Because we had people call for Colorado History Day on August 1st going, are you going to gold pan again? Are you going to gold pan again? And we're like, we can't. You're too close together. We're sorry. But they that's a year ago, and that lady's bringing her kids back.
Yeah.
Increased partnerships. It becomes easier for you to do business with community partners. So you can approach a microbrewery and say, hey, let's do a beer tasting related to history. Now, I notice you have some beer, or, hey, flour mill up the road, can you give us our flour can you do retail flour sales and give us our flour for our Orno? And yes, it's okay to put their logo, if you're not doing it already, giving them publicity is absolutely what is required here. Just make sure you talk to your development marketing people so you're doing it correctly. Another big one is others seeking your product or brand. And what does that mean? Marketing terms. When I'm visited, and it usually happens a couple times a year by our local museums, checking out what I'm doing, that's a sign of success. And it's easy to feel territorial about it a little bit, but really that's a sign of success. They respect what you're doing. And finally, I should have put patron and volunteer or patron and staff excitement, not dread over new ideas. So when I took over my museum, Fort Vasquez Museum, 4 years ago, there was a lot of dread. Oh my gosh, they're going to sell it or change it or it's horrible. When that stops being more or becomes less and less prevalent, in other words, wow, this is a new thing, I didn't think of that. That is a huge sign of success. Just keep doing it. One of the other measurable goals is that and it kind of ties into this, is that you're willing to change and create new instead of relying on the old, taking the risk. And so that pretty much is how you know that what you're doing is making, if you're not doing a lot of these, you haven't hit success and you need to continue to innovate and try new things. But often my own staff will tell me, or my own volunteers, if we're innovating well by not having fear over it. So that pretty much wraps up the presentation of what I consider creating relevance in living history. You should always be doing it. And the fact that we need to have a class about it tells you that things still need to change. And, traditionalism isn't bad. It's just, it's right now in the world we live in, it's a hard model to follow, to always do the same thing over and over. So yeah. Any comments, questions for me, Karen, or anything?
Gosh, it's all really pertains to either what I walked into, what I've, how it is now. And then of course I'm looking at that whole idea of reset going forward.
Well,
so it's very interesting because we are right in that point of, I created some new things because when I started, there was nothing. It was 4 walls, ceiling and floor at the, and then a couple buildings. So then I tried to do that outside the box. thinking of new things, creating those experiences. And we really, it took off. Just the numbers of visitors alone was amazing, and the response, like you say, well, aren't we doing it this year? We did it last year. And now there's some different challenges I have with not competing, but with the department, because the interpretive side is really their low priority because it's an open space. And so it has different funding. But so now I'm at that point, because they couldn't help keep the program going for the interpretive, I had to cut back. And so now COVID's hit. So now I'm trying to go back and, apply all the, things I've learned and recreate the new experience so that we can go forward.
Yeah, there's an old There's an old cowboy or mountain man saying, there is no problems, just changes of plans, right? And that's kind of how I've looked at this year with the plague, is that this is an opportunity to get stuff done and to change what isn't working.
Right, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and so it's a great way to do that. Unfortunately, we're making lemonade out of lemons, right?
Exactly.
The one thing that, if I was going to impart to you with my experience, is always try to be as flexible. It's tough. I mean, there's a lot of challenges with so many facets, not just budget and managers and volunteers, right? But it's just the amount of, just the resources that aren't money or people can be very challenging. And there is, in the West, there is more of a focus on natural history than there is on cultural history.
Yes.
And it seems, in my opinion, to get more and more challenging the further west you go. There's way more focus on nature in the West than there is back east. And so we're in the kind of the sweet spot for a balance of both. So that might be the way you conquer it, is how can you do both? How can you make both happen? You don't always have to be historical, but when you're doing living history, you got to rely on that authentic voice and those things. But there might be a marriage there of natural history and cultural history. So think about it. And it's always thinking on your feet in some form of how to best address with what you have and create that. So I encourage you to keep watching the videos. Find more videos. I mean, there's a lot I didn't show. And like I said, if this was a live presentation, we would have done this with live speakers or people online calling in. But the great thing about YouTube and the internet is that you can find lots of different ways to do this. So any other questions?
Just one last one. I know you had mentioned with the ALFAM group, but any recommendations for like any groups of living history people in Colorado that
so
would be
reenactors,
beneficial for me to just kind of learn from or be a part of the group?
I can put you in touch with some people who could be helpful for you. Yeah. Go ahead and email me as a sidebar.
Sure.
There's sites like Rockledge Ranch, there's Bent's Fort, there's Fort Garland, which is in our system. There is Colorado, Wyoming Area Museums has a lot of living history resources. That's an association like ALFAM, but it's more regional, so it's Colorado, Wyoming. It's a pretty tight-knit community. I mean, once you start meeting people, they'll know other people to send you to. And, please, part of this workshop is if you have questions at any time, please feel free to ask me questions, because a lot of this job is done by relationships, just like the relationships with the community, the relationship with the living history community are also, and the preservation community, the museum community are all integral for success. So don't feel
Right.
bashful. If I know an expert, I'll send you that way. Get my knowledge for free. So.
Well, that's part of it, is trying to navigate through the whole system with learning.
Right.
Yeah, because it's all in who do you know, and then
And
who does
still,
that person know, and
because Freeman Tilden said that this was an art form, and art is very subjective, and so nobody, not Cable and Beck, not Frank Vignoni, not Alfam workshops, nobody out there I know has truly defined. There is no, okay, to get these outcomes, you must do A, B, and C, which gets you Z. None of that's happened. And I don't think it ever can be done, because as much as it doesn't reinvent itself, or hasn't until lately, it's indescribable. There's just things you intrinsically learn. Like doing theater or learning to sing, these are intangibles. So.
right.
Well, again, if you need any more help, please do not hesitate to reach out. You have my contact information.
I do.
Thank you for
so
being
much.
my student and sitting through all 3 parts.
All
Hello,
I can say
now.
is people don't know what they missed if they're in this.
That's a very high
business.
compliment. Thank you. Thank you very much. And
I
please.
have really appreciated it. There's so much I have learned, and you've opened my eyes to how to look at everything. So.
Well, good. That was a goal, is to at least set you on the path. So thanks again. And again, reach out with any questions.
I will. Thanks so much, Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Karen.
Right. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Have a great night.
Thanks, Janelle.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.